Today on Blue 58, the Packers tight ends are young, promising, and exciting. What can we expect from this talented position group in 2024?
Blue 58!
Hello and welcome to another episode of Blue 58, the one and only podcast of thepowersweep.com. I'm your host, John Meerdink. Happy to be with you here for another episode. I'm back. It's good to be back. We had a good week last week, and it's good that we come back today. Today's an important day, but before I get to why it's important, it's just a brief story from our time away. Life pro tip for those of you who have kids and are out and about. If you're ever in an unfamiliar city, or just a city where you're not at home and you need to kill some time before the next thing you're going to do is set to begin, head to a local library. Great place to kill time. If you've got kids of a certain age, there's almost always something for them to do there. If you're lucky and you're like where we were, there's a bookstore in the library selling used book. Spent way too much money on that kind of stuff while we were away. But the library I walked into in Bloomington, Indiana, about a week ago now, well, not quite a week ago, as I was walking in, a guy recognized the hat I was wearing as a Packers hat. Not that hard to do. But we get to talking, and it turns out he's from Wisconsin, lives with his wife in Bloomington, is retired. She's retired as well. They're just living out their golden years in Bloomington, and he started telling me about his time as a Packers fan growing up in Wisconsin, which included rooting for guys like Tobin Rote and Tony Canadeo. Now, Rote last played for the Packers in 1956, and Tony Canadeo last laced him up for the Packers in 1952. So that should give you an idea of how old this gentleman was. Not that there's anything wrong with that, and he was a delight to talk to, but he shared a lot of cool stories, including seeing the Packers play an exhibition basketball game in Baraboo, Wisconsin, when he was 9 years old. Fun guy to talk to. Enjoyed just shooting the breeze with him about the Packers for a little bit. But that kind of thing is what makes doing the Power Sweep and Blue 58 so special to me, is the connections with people. And I start the podcast this way because today is the 8th birthday of the Power Sweep and Blue 58. This whole project launched 8 years ago on July 16th, 2016. I remember where I was sitting, not doing the job I was supposed to be doing in my day job at the time, but hit publish on the first post of thepowersweep.com on this day in 2016, and just have enjoyed every minute of it since then. I don't want to make this a long, drawn-out thing, but just wanted to say that I appreciate hitting this milestone, and I thank you for being along for the ride as we've gotten to this point. I often think about the tagline I put on every episode of Blue 58, because I often wonder, are we actually making people smarter Packers fans? I hope so. I think we're trying, and I think that's all that we can really do. Just try with as much research as we can to kind of be as neutral as possible and just try to be smart about what we're doing with Packers stuff. So the mission continues here into year 9. So 3 quick thank yous as we hit that milestone. First, thanks to my wife for putting up with all of this and for helping to make it happen, watching the kids, tolerating late nights when I'm doing Packers stuff. When I probably should be sleeping. She makes it go in ways that are seen and unseen and has occasionally appeared on the podcast as well. Thanks to Gary Zillevy for helping us get this started and working hard in the early years of the Power Sweep. And thank you to you for listening and reading, because if you didn't, this would all be pretty pointless. I would still do it. I would still do a podcast and write about the Packers, but it would be a lot weirder than it is right now. And I say that as a guy sitting in his basement talking into a microphone by himself. So just consider how much weirder that could be. Like I say, every time we hit a milestone, I'll say it when we hit 800 episodes later this year, when we hit 1,000 episodes next year at some point. I don't know how long this thing is going to go on. I've never had a plan on that front. There's no specific milestone I want to get to. There's no exit plan here. But I can tell you that I don't have any plans to end anytime soon. And I can tell that I'm not going to be done with this kind of stuff anytime soon, because on our trip, I couldn't stop thinking about the podcast and things I wanted to write about and talk about, and I couldn't wait to get back to recording. And every time I've had to take off because of health stuff or traveling or work just being crazy or whatever, it's never felt like a relief, like, oh, I don't have to do the podcast. So that seems like a good sign to me that this project is in good shape, and we have a lot of good years of Packers coverage ahead of us. Unless the NFL implodes or something like that. And then we'll make a podcast about something else. I'm not going to stop. I've got all the equipment, so I might as well. But thank you for listening and for putting up, even with maybe a little self-referential stuff like this, in the podcast from time to time. Today is an especially good day for me, not just an anniversary, but we get to talk about tight ends today. And I didn't plan it this way. It just happened that it worked out that the first day back from a little bit of time off was the 8th-year birthday, and we get to talk tight ends today. I want to start with an anecdote, as I often do. Back in the day when I was a real little kid, 6, 7, 8, something like that, we had this family devotional that we'd read from time to time after dinner. And one of the stories, there are all this little stories about, it was like this frontier family, almost like a Laura Ingalls Wilder type thing, and it was supposed to teach you life lessons and stuff like that. Maybe it did, maybe it didn't. But one of the stories that I often remember is, and you see stories like this pop up all the time in cartoon shows, movies, whatever. But the kid in the family, one of the kids wanted a pet. And his dad kept telling him, you're not ready, you're not ready. And finally he relents and says, look, prove to me that you can work hard to take care of your own animal and you will get one. And he works hard for however long it is. And eventually his dad surprises him with 2 goats of his very own. They're a farm family for him to take care of. And they finally got them after working so hard and waiting for so long. I feel like that kid heading into 2024 because for a long time I've wanted dynamic tight ends in Green Bay, and now we've got 2 very interesting ones, very young prospects who had very, very promising 2024 seasons. Just for so long, I've wanted it to be this way. The story about Tony Gonzalez nearly getting traded to the Packers in 2008 or 2009, whichever year it was, has haunted me for a long time just because of what he could have meant to that era of the Packers. And I just have wanted dynamic tight end play for a long time because since basically Jermichael Finley got hurt, we're going on a dozen years now, there really hasn't been a consistent threat at tight end in Green Bay. And not only do we have one now in Luke Musgrave, we've got 2 that are good. And most interestingly of all, they are good in different ways. And there are some interesting players for us to follow this year beyond those guys. And it's been an interesting position to watch evolve under Matt LaFleur because Matt LaFleur inherited Jimmy Graham. He had Josiah DeGuara. That was somebody he really wanted to make a part of the offense. Dominique Daphne, they've tried to other versions of that player. John Lovett, who is technically a fullback, but what is a fullback and what is a tight end in Matt LaFleur's offense? They've tried a bunch of different guys and haven't ever been able to really get it together in a way that the tight ends feels like a full participant in the offense. But now, here we are with Luke Musgrave and Tucker Kraft, and we are set to go in 2024. So let's talk tight ends. First, want to mention again our Patreon and our Substack, patreon.com/thepowersweep, thepowersweep.substack.com. Support us either of those places for any dollar amount, and you will have access to our Discord server and the bonus content we are publishing on a weekly basis, resuming again this week after a couple of weeks off. Just if you want this project to keep going and want to help us keep it going, continue supporting there, consider supporting there, and you'll have access to all those great benefits as well, including if you support at certain levels on Patreon, some exclusive merch options too. So just wanted to mention that, give you a plug there. And as we're heading into football season, you might want to consider joining up and joining the conversation on our Discord server. The tight ends. Not just tons of them to talk about. We've got 6 of them on the roster right now. 2 of them, I think, are not really worthy of like in-depth conversation. But the other 4 all either played significant roles on the Packers or would have played significant roles on the Packers if not for an injury to Tyler Davis. Up first, the 2 guys who fall into our no expectations camp. Since it's been a while, remember, we sort guys into 4 different groups: no expectations, low, medium, moderate, and high expectations group. And then we want to talk through why each of those guys fall into those camps or groups as well, or categories. Your no expectations guys are kind of lottery tickets here. If something comes of one of these 2 guys, it would be a nice surprise, but nobody is expecting anything from them. And those 2 guys are Messiah Swinson and Joel Wilson. Swinson has had a bit of an itinerant college career, 2024 undrafted free agent, but a big guy, 6'7", 259 pounds, so I am contractually obligated to be excited about him. How funny is it that the Packers completely remake their tight end position and then literally add a guy named Messiah? On top of everything else, we've got the actual Messiah coming to the tight end room. Not too shabby. Joel Wilson also falls into this group as well. Late season addition to the practice squad. Late November came on and stuck through the offseason. He spent a little bit of time with the Bills in a similar capacity, had a fairly productive college career. But I think we have a hard time putting him right now ahead of even Ben Sims, who's probably the lowest regarded of the remaining tight ends on the roster. Again, not super high on either Swinson or Wilson, but you can't entirely count them out either, especially when they have size like a guy like Swinson does. But moving to low expectations, 2 of the 4 remaining guys fall into this group. The first is Ben Sims, who came over to Green Bay as a waiver claim from the Minnesota Vikings after final roster cuts last year. Was a pretty good athlete in his pre-draft testing, was a pre-draft target for the Packers last year as well, had a visit with the Packers, and ended up playing about 200 snaps on offense, 189, and 97 on special teams after Tyler Davis went down with an ACL injury late in training camp. Honestly, that was less on special teams than I really had envisioned for Sims. I thought he would become a core special teams player after Tyler Davis went down, but that ended up not really being the case. He was much more of a factor on offense, whatever amount of a factor he really was, which really wasn't too much. But just looking at the rest of the roster around him, I think it's hard to have anything other than low expectations for Sims. What we saw from him last year was essentially a cameo player on offense with some special team snaps sprinkled in. Over the course of 17 games, 97 snaps is not all that much on special teams, so it wasn't like he was a core special teams player. Not to get too far ahead of ourselves, but just for comparison, Tyler Davis played 346 snaps on special teams in 2022. So if you're looking for a one-to-one replacement for Davis after Davis went down in Sims, he missed the mark by a fairly wide margin, which again, kind of surprising. I think Sims fit really what Rich Bisaccia has seemed to have wanted from somebody who plays on special teams, who does the sort of things that Tyler Davis was doing on special teams in 22. It seems like Sims was a natural fit there, but just never really grew into a role there, just never had much to do on special teams over the course of the entire season. So low expectations, mainly depth chart stuff, but the bar was pretty low to begin with. There's really no reason to think he's going to be much higher than that. He meets them like a lot of low roster guys we've talked about will. He's just got to be around, be available, and wait for his opportunity to come if it indeed ever comes around. I don't think there's much reason to think he's going to be anything more than the Packers' 4th tight end this year, and that's my big prediction for him. He will be the Packers' 4th tight end, but I don't know in what capacity that will be. I don't know if that's on the practice squad or the 53-man roster. I think it probably comes down to what Matt LaFleur thinks about Henry Pearson. Henry Pearson is listed on the roster as a fullback right now, but as we said earlier in this very episode, fullback and tight end have been kind of interchangeable, especially over the last couple of years in the Matt LaFleur offense. What does that mean for those low roster guys like Sims and Pearson? Right now, I think it's probably Pearson that makes it, even though the Packers had a much better run game, I think, out of backfields without a lead blocker than with them last year. But LaFleur seems bound and determined to make something like that happen. So if that's what he wants to do, who is the guy that he keeps around? I don't think that's Tyler Davis, but I think Davis is ahead of Sims. Is it Sims or is it Pearson? I kind of think it leans Pearson at this point, and then you go from there with practice squad elevations depending on what you need outside of that core group. Things can change. Things will change. I think right now Sims is probably behind Pearson. That leaves the Packers probably with only 3 tight ends on the 53-man roster, but how many do you really need, especially as heavily as those top 2 are going to be playing in Musgrave and Kraft? But again, we're getting ahead of ourselves. The next guy up is Tyler Davis, who we've kind of talked about at angles here through the podcast to this point. One of the toughest breaks all of last year was Tyler Davis. Coming into a contract year, he tears his ACL right at the end of training camp and thus misses the entire season. I suppose it could have been worse if he had been in a contract year and then tore his ACL in, like the Packers' divisional round game or something like that, like we thought was going to happen with J.J. Enagbare, but he ends up not missing any time at all. But all that to say, it could have been worse. He could have gone into a contract year, played the whole year, and then been out of luck heading into free agency. But He goes through his recovery process, and the Packers re-signed him this offseason. Don't read too much into that signing, though. According to overthecap.com, the final dollars on that contract, 1 year, $1,075,000 with no guaranteed money. As far as fake contracts go, that is about as fake as it gets. Like, you are technically under contract, but you got to make the roster, be active for games, get your game checks and stuff like that. Zero guaranteed money for you. Tyler Davis is not assured a spot on this roster right now, and I think accordingly expectations have to be low. Because on the one hand, the Packers do seem to want a lot from him. Rich Bisaccia has been high on him. Matt LaFleur has spoken highly about him. Brian Gutekunst has spoken highly about him. But we don't know right now how much he can give, so I think we have to default to pretty low expectations. So kind of like Sims, he meets expectations by just surviving, be the Packers' whatever tight end. And I think he's going to do it. I think he's going to be their third tight end. I think he's going to reclaim his role and be a big special teams contributor again this year. So he's going to make it. He's going to play a lot on special teams. We'll set the bar at, let's say, 250 special team snaps for Tyler Davis this year. I don't even want to go so far as making predictions about him on offense because I don't know how we look at the tight end rotation after Musgrave and Kraft. But I think Davis is going to be in the picture on the Packers 53-man roster in some capacity. So that brings us to our high expectations players. And both Tucker Kraft and Luke Musgrave has to fall into that category. There's really no reason not to. And it's hard to talk about Kraft and Musgrave almost as anything other than this like two-headed tight end entity. They're really more like Tucker Musgrave and Luke Kraft. They're or like hyphenated Tucker Musgrave Kraft or Luke Musgrave Kraft. They're just two guys that are kind of stuck together in how they're talked about and thought about, even though they have very different skill sets as players. Kraft is the traditional, like he should be the hand on the ground, inline, tough physical guy, and Musgrave is your big slot receiver. But that's not really how they tried to play Musgrave last year, though we'll get to him in here in a second. Let's start out with let's start out with Tucker Kraft and talk through his stuff first. Rough start last year, but he definitely blossomed when Luke Musgrave went down. There's a lot more to it than this, but just to throw one set of numbers at you, weeks 1 through 8 last year, 2 catches for 5 yards for Tucker Kraft, but weeks 9 through 18 of the regular season, 29 catches, 350 yards, and 2 touchdowns, which is a pretty respectable full season stat line for a rookie tight end, and he did that just weeks 9 to 18. Not too shabby. Expectations are high because he's half of the tight end tandem, the most promising tight end tandem we've had in Green Bay since, I don't know, are we talking Mark Chmura and Keith Jackson like 1996? It's in that neighborhood. There hasn't been a good enough pair of tight ends to really make that comparison since then. I mean, 21st century, are you talking Bubba Franks and David Martin or Tyrone Davis? I liked all those guys for what they were, but these guys should be better than all of those guys, and they're on track to be talked about as some of the great tight ends of the 21st century for the Packers even at this point, because it just hasn't been that great here in the 21st century. So I think Kraft, all that being said, really just has to build on where he was last year to meet expectations. He was so good down the stretch last year that I think he really just has to round out or smooth out some of the rough edges to his game, and he's going to be in really good shape for 2024. Could use some work as a blocker, but all young tight ends do. He could do a little bit more in the passing game, but that's probably just a question of opportunities, and he should have more opportunities early this year than he did last year just because of how he played down the stretch last year. So I think he's going to have a fairly productive statistical year. Let's put it at around 35 catches, 400 yards, and 2 touchdowns. I think he's going to meet or exceed all of those numbers. And that brings us to Luke Musgrave, who is one of, if not the most physically gifted tight end we've ever seen in Green Bay. He is right there with Jermichael Finley, who some of his testing numbers were a bit depressed at Texas, and he still put up good numbers because of an injury that offseason. He probably could have put up even better numbers, and you saw it on the field. Right there in the Packers' run there early in the Aaron Rodgers era. He was an athletic game changer when he was at his best in Green Bay, and Musgrave is right there athletically with where Finley was. But had a bit of a stop and go, up and down, fits and starts season in 2023. In part because I feel like the Packers couldn't really find a role for him. I don't want to belabor this point because we've talked about it in previous episodes this offseason, but they couldn't seem to decide whether they wanted to use him in line or split out, or target him heavily, or just have him sprinkled in occasionally into the game. It really wasn't coming together until it did. In the last 3 games before he went on injured reserve with that lacerated kidney, 9 catches, 143 yards, and a touchdown. Best 3-game stretch of the season by far, even including the big score he had against Dallas in the wild card round. There was a lot to like about his rookie season at his best. If you look at the good stuff, there was plenty of good in his 2023 and plenty of bad too. But I think the bad stuff just comes again with not really knowing what he was or how to fit him in. There is a pretty steep learning curve for young tight ends. Our research bears that out. There is a pretty substantial jump, though, for between guys going from their first year to their second year, bigger than any other jump over their first 4 years in the league. Most guys are who they are by some point in their second season. Our research has borne that out, and I think that takeaway is just going to continue to get stronger as we go further into gathering data on that about how these guys grow in the league. We're going to see what they are able to do over their early career, but the Packers should be pretty optimistic. I would think about both Kraft and Musgrave with what they're going to do here in their second year, because history bears it out that guys do make a pretty big jump at tight end from year 1 to year 2. So expectations, I think, are pretty high. Like with Kraft, and even more so with Musgrave, it comes with the territory. You were a promising rookie. You've got great athletic testing numbers. You were a second-round draft pick. Acquired in part with capital that was available because of the Aaron Rodgers trade. There are a lot of things that raise the expectations pretty high for Luke Musgrave, so how does he meet them? Just like Tucker Kraft, just got to build and grow. Just be a little bit better than where you were last year. And I think that puts him right around the 50-catch, 600-yard, 4-touchdown mark. I think that's a pretty good expectation for Luke Musgrave. There's no reason he can't meet that. He was well on his way to numbers in that ballpark when he went down last year with a pretty scary-sounding injury. Don't want to lacerate anything in my body. But he was on pace for those kind of numbers, and there's no reason he can't meet that. I do kind of want to address something that I guess hinted at with both here and both with Musgrave and with Kraft, fairly modest statistical increases. I'm trying to balance the idea of these guys improving from where they were last year, which I think they will, with kind of everyone else in the passing game improving as well, and there only being so many completions and catches and targets to go around. Fairly modest statistical increases for both Kraft and Musgrave, but I think that fits with the overall kind of schematic and personnel reality with the Packers, if everyone stays relatively healthy, that there's going to be a lot of guys who need targets and can get targets, can earn targets in this offense. So just maybe not huge statistical explosions for all these guys, but that I don't think is reflective of where they're going to be as players. There's no reason not to assume that this is going to be a talented skill position group. The Packers receivers and tight ends and their running backs too. There's a lot to like here. And if you are a Packers fan, there's good reason to like it. You're not just being a homer. You're not just one of those people who's always the Packers are the best no matter what. I'm not even saying they're the best, in the NFC North or the AFC or the NFC, or certainly not the AFC or the NFL. But this is a good group, regardless of how it compares to others. You've got some good talent here. You've got some very talented guys, and I think you should be optimistic about what these tight ends can do heading into year 2, especially Musgrave and Kraft. There's a lot to like here. Among these young tight ends. And 3 of these top 4 guys are heading into just their second year too. So a lot of growth to be had out there as well. That's all I've got for you in this episode of Blue 58. I appreciate you tuning in today and over the past 8 years as we've continued to grow and figure out what this project is and what it should be. Thank you for helping us make it into the best thing it can be, and for listening and giving feedback and your thoughts all the way. So thank you for doing that. And thank you for sharing this podcast and recommending it. I do see a lot of the recommendations out there. I'm not a Reddit user, but every so often somebody drops me a thread where people recommend the podcast. It warms my heart, even though I'm scared to read it because, I just I'm afraid of what people are saying about it out there sometimes, quite honestly. And it's always nice when people pass along the nice things and stuff like that. So I appreciate you sharing the word and getting the word out there. Continue to do that. That is the number one way that we grow and get people involved in this conversation you and I are having about the Green Bay Packers, which in turn helps all of us, me included, maybe me especially, become smarter Packers fans. And as I always say, smarter Packers fans are better Packers fans, and better Packers fans are what we all want to be. I'm your host, John Meerdink. We'll see you next time on Blue 58.